Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're here in the US, Eastern Standard Time. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Maksud Aftab. I'm a neuroradiologist, and I was one of the faculty teaching these seminars on Islam and bioscience to high school students as well as pre-medical college students, which we did in Chicago and in Malaysia. And I'll share with you some of the insights and some of the techniques that we used to teach the seminar that myself and Sheikh Hamza Karamali taught, specifically on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and the soul. So what we tried to do, this is an outline of the seminar. Basically, what we tried to do was to introduce students not just to the advances in science, specifically neuroscience and AI, but also to introduce them to philosophy of science, help them think about the big picture of where science and modern scientific research fits into the big picture, the worldview in which it operates. So to understand where neuroscience and modern scientific research fits, one of the main driving forces in modern neuroscience is this idea of neuroscientific reductionism. The idea that if we can just understand the brain better, we would understand everything there is to know about the human being. And in philosophy, this view is called physicalism. And this has some significant consequences, both for those who come from a theological background, but even in a secular bioethical framework, there's issues related to free will, moral agency, personhood, self, and mental health. So we'll start by going over the neuroscientific research framework, which is to present to the students how current scientific neuroresearch is conducted. In the field of medicine and neuroscience, we have learned so much about the brain, the mind, and consciousness that we think of all of these things to be interconnected and intimately linked. So consciousness and the mind are considered to be sort of functions of the brain, just like other organs in the body have functions, like the heart pumps blood, the kidney filters the blood, the pancreas produces hormones like insulin and so forth. And the way that we study the brain is basically by these scientific methods like biochemical spectroscopy, functional MRI, EEG, and even using AI algorithms. And we have made tremendous progress. So this is a reconstructed image of the brain using functional MRI. We're seeing activation in parts of the brain associated with the dorsal mode network, which is basically the areas of the brain that are activated in the setting of conscious awareness. Conscious awareness is another way of saying phenomenal consciousness, or our sense of personal I-ness or selfness. And we know that this is closely associated with not just the areas of the brain directly associated with the experience, but also with this wide network of connectivity, and specifically this area in the posterior aspect of the brain called the precuneus plays a critical role in our conscious awareness. There have also been studies that have been pretty impressive, and I'll just give you one example of this study in which functional MRI was used to reconstruct a auditory stimulus that was provided to the patient. So a passage is read to the patient, and without the patient having to repeat it, just looking at their brain scan along with an applied artificial intelligence algorithm, they're able to pretty accurately reconstruct what was read to the patient. So in all of these cases, and there's been many other experiments with visual stimuli and so forth, it is becoming very, very clear that what it is to be a human, what it is to be the mind, consciousness, and the brain are all very, very closely linked, if not the same thing. And in fact, this is the dominant view within modern neuroscience. This is the presumed hypothesis. And as Francis Crick, one of the pioneer scientists in DNA science, stated very eloquently, in his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. You, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, and your ambition, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So here we need to step back and see what is happening and how we got here and what are the consequences of this type of a view. So to the students, we want them to begin to think about the big picture and the worldview that is implied by adopting the preceding physicalist narrative that we just discussed. Some of the consequences of this type of a view is the denial of the first-person experience. So the first-person experience is then necessarily an illusion. There is no subjective experience. Everything that is happening is just a function of inputs and outputs of the brain. And if there is any personal experience, that is simply an illusion or an artifact of the function of the brain. Secondly, it implies physicalism, that all that exists is the physical substance that makes up the brain and its interconnection and networks. And that is all there is needed to explain what it is to be human. Thirdly, it results in negation of any type of dualism. So most traditional frameworks of humanity are based on some type of dualism, whether it's substance dualism, soul and body, mind and body, Cartesian dualism. This is all considered to be nonsensical in the neuroscientific paradigm for the study of consciousness that exists today. And what this implies then is that the artificial intelligence bot and the human only differ from each other in their mechanism of function. So a human is a neurobiological creature, whereas an AI bot would just be an electronic computational creature. So the difference in flying between an airplane versus a bird, it's just how they do it. So to help our students understand what's missing here, we invite them to step back and introduce them to some concepts in the philosophy of science. We talked a lot about epistemology, but in this particular regard of human nature, we want to talk about ontology. Ontology is the science of what are the types of things that exist. What is the intrinsic nature of things? So once we know what are the types of things that exist, we can go about trying to prove whether they're true or not. But if we only assume that only certain types of things exist, then we are automatically excluding some things from the world. So the question becomes, what are the types of things that exist in the world? And we'll get to that. But specifically for modern science is restricted to studying physical substances using empirical methods. And this is what the scientific revolution and part of the Enlightenment was all about. Galileo made this innovation where he suggested that the world can be represented mathematically using things like mass, volume, length, shape, and velocity. And this became the foundations for modern science. So modern science then is third person, objective, and reproducible. And what it left out was the first person experiences and subjective experiences. And this was deliberately done. This type of reductive science differed from historical understandings of natural philosophy and science like we find in Aristotle and in the Muslim theological tradition, in which there was form and body, atom and accident, which included both the material and the immaterial aspect of things. So to get the students to get their head around this, we had them do this thought experiment and this group activity in which we asked them to list what are the types of things that exist in the world. And most students will come up with lists like mountains and rivers and minerals and atoms, but very few will talk about the existence of love or hate or smell or taste. Whereas these second category of things, nobody can deny are just as real as the first, and they do in fact exist in the world. But these are things that are not quantifiable and cannot be studied by science. And one of those things that cannot be studied, that is difficult to study by physical processes is the nature of consciousness itself. Because at the end of the day, our conscious experience of ourselves is a subjective experience that cannot be denied by the individual having the experience. And we convey this to the students by using the famous article by Thomas Nagel, the American philosopher Thomas Nagel, What It Is Like to Be a Bat. And we further help them understand the difference between sort of quantifiable aspects of something versus the qualia, or the non-quantifiable. So if you look at an apple, you have the measurable aspects of the apple, the size and shape, weight, and you have the non-quantifiable, like the taste, the smell, the texture, and so forth. These are things that are necessarily left out of the empirical study of an object. And then we also led the students through a number of thought experiments. The famous Mary's Room experiment, which was preceded by Ibn Tufail's blind man experiment, basically pointing out that there is more to things than simply their physical existence and material. There is something else that is gained by the experience itself. And of course, the Ibn Sina's flying man experiment, which anticipates Descartes' I think, therefore I am thought experiment, essentially affirming the real existence of ourselves outside or distinct from the material existence of our bodies. To help, so those are some of the thoughts on neuroscience, and we'll get back to that. We also talked about artificial intelligence, and in this we discussed with the students the difference between intelligence and consciousness. So in terms of functionality, can AIs replace everything that the humans can do? Pretty much. We know that they can drive cars with these language models. It's amazing what they can do. But the question becomes, if humans have an essence, can they replace that? And what are the types of things that AI may not be able to replace, or we need to question whether it can replace? These would be the types of things like knowledge, understanding, and spirituality. And to help the students understand this, we went through the Chinese room experiment of John Searle, in which he is communicating using a language he does not know, and the question becomes whether or not he has an understanding or knowledge of that language. Finally, we return back to neuroscientific limits of the study of consciousness, and point out that when we do study consciousness scientifically, all we are doing is studying it from a third-person perspective, and we are missing out or setting aside the first-person perspective. So there are newer understandings of science which seek to expand the role of science to include those first-person experiences, and these are all different types of panpsychism and property dualism, which scientists and philosophers themselves are realizing that there are limits of science which need to be expanded. So this was primarily what we'd hope to convey to the students, to not just study science, but to look at the philosophy of science, move away from a narrow understanding of mechanism towards holism, and understand the worldview in which our modern science operates today. Thank you so much, and it's an honor to speak to you today. Thank you.